Thank you, Susan. Yes, I felt very privileged to be part of this whole project. It's been a wonderful experience in spite of the pace that we've had to keep up of analysing paintings. That in itself has been very useful because we've covered such a lot of ground and a lot of paintings. And unlike a great many other projects that have gone before it, it's not concentrating on one particular artist or one school, but covering a whole range of different quality of paintings and from different workshops. So that what's emerging are general patterns which are becoming very useful, and although it's still work in progress, it's I think going to be very interesting to see what emerges in the end. I have occasionally wondered whether looking at paintings with such close scrutiny as I do, and with scientific analysis, might diminish my admiration for the extraordinary illusionistic techniques that have been used, and the power of these paintings. But it's really the very reverse, and looking at them closely and looking at them under the microscope gives us a very fresh idea of how painters worked. And it's almost like, and I'll be looking at this a little bit later, but looking in this detail, as Aviva says, is a new form of connoisseurship. It's like visiting the artist's studio and seeing how the painter, when you look at a detail like that, seeing how the painters mix the paint, put the ground on. If I'm looking at a cross-section, I can see the way the priming layer is laid, and then the tiny dabs of paint, the touch of a highlight. It's an extraordinarily useful way of building up an idea of an artist's working practice. And this whole study has deepened my respect for the sophisticated knowledge of optics of these painters, painting with microscopic detail, and which, as Hilliard says, quoting from Cicero, should be aptly placed to deceive the eye. What seems to be clear is the Tudor artist's crucial understanding of the degree to which the eye can be deceived, and the ways in which the eye can be deceived. Illusions of rich colours and textures, and the way they were created on a microscopic scale, show us the artist knowing about the concept of perception without awareness, not knowing how an effect was created. But being able to perceive it and to perceive the qualities in a painting. So over the last 3 years, the investigation has brought to light various unexpected colours and textures, and I'm going to do a sort of highlight or whistle-stop tour of some of those, and looking at really what sort of information we're getting from this project. On each work, my research begins by closely examining the surface with Sophie Plender and Sally Marriott, and then taking samples where necessary or possible. And the illustration of me taking samples made it look as though I was going to be digging into the middle of a pristine painting, but of course one looks for the possibility of taking a sample, not always so. And then going back to UCL lab and identifying the pigments and techniques, and then attempting to characterize the original appearance of the painting. So that's what I'm going to be looking at just now. And the first part, identifying the pigments, I sometimes find it slightly frustrating to be doing it in UCL without the context, without being able to discuss the findings immediately with my colleagues with whom I've been looking at the painting. And one of the most exciting moments for me, my primary research interest being pigments, was the discovery under the microscope of this purple pigment. Sorry, it's slightly blurry, this side, in the Baron Berner's costume. Now, this is rarely encountered purple pigment fluorite, and it was that gave me the sort of eureka moment in the lab, just finding this. And purple has been found on many occasions in the paintings that we've been looking at. These are often sort of slightly duller purples, yellow, black, and red are fairly common. And then there's on the upper right, there's, sorry, I could point. This is azurite and a solid red with a little bit of crimson lake. So either red earth or vermilion and crimson lake, and a little bit of white, gives a very nice solid purple. And then the most beautiful purple is on the curtain. This is from the curtain. I'm sorry I haven't got a picture of it, but from Cranmer, which Maurice already showed us. The curtain, the rather dull brown curtain, and of course it's got smalt in it. So the medium has gone brown, and this is crimson lake, which only survives in bits. So it's really lost that purple. This purple is a pure purple pigment, and it comes from particular places in Europe. So what's interesting about its finding on this Berners is, apart from the fact that it's actually used for a purple costume, whereas most findings, I think, that Marika's come across have been in Marika Spring, has come across, are in backgrounds, walls, or supporting roles to a crimson lake to make it more purple. Here it seems to be used pretty well by itself, and with some white and a little black in the shadows. It's from an area, well, one of the areas that it comes from is the Austrian Tyrol and South Germany and the Ardennes. And so the painter of this portrait, Ambrosius Benson, we have to ask, might he have picked, he came from Italy originally, but was working in Bruges, and did he pick up some of this this unusual pigment on his way across the Alps, or in fact, if he was working in Bruges, he might have got it from the Ardennes, which is relatively close. It seems that he painted this painting of the sitter, Baron Berners, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer for Henry VIII and living in Calais. And it may be that this erudite man and well-connected international sitter was aware of that, or in fact invited the use of this fluorite, perhaps even haven't got hold of it himself. So those are questions that arise from it. They're, of course, speculative, and I'd love more input on that from other people. The only other finding of purple in this project of a purple colour was in this painting of Thomas Gresham, also Chancellor of the Exchequer, a lot later. This is 40 years later, I don't know whether it's fluorite or not, and we still have to. This was a tiny sample, a dispersion, not a cross section, and very, very little pigment, and so we haven't been able to analyse it by EDX and get a firm answer on whether it's fluorite. It looks like fluorite, but it was found on the silky purse of the costume. And you can see that there's a slight difference between the blacks, and I'm sorry that Sophie Plender isn't giving her talk on blacks, because there's a huge amount to be said about the different sorts of use of blacks here. But this glossy black. I wondered what had made it, and so took a tiny sample from an extra loss, and it turned out to have this fluorite in it. We don't know whether, of course, it's on the surface or whether it's mixed into the black. This is another finding of pigment, a particular pigment actually had a direct bearing on characterizing a workshop. And these two paintings you may have seen in the exhibition when they were briefly together. And we were looking for similarities, of course, and there were lots of materials that bound the two closely together, more closely together than hitherto. Ian Tars played a seminal role in determining this with dendrochronology, but I'm sure he's going to tell you about that later. One of the less dramatic findings, but perhaps the most compelling evidence to me, was that they came from the same workshop, was the finding of the employment of this bright, modern-looking green, which I thought at first was a retouching, but it isn't. And it's the artificially made copper carbonate verditer, green verditer, rarely used. I haven't found it in any other of the many paintings that we've looked at. These paintings, of course, have been attributed to Hilliard, and so I looked up what he said about it in his limning on miniature painting, and he says not to use green verditer because it's ill-smelling and ill-tasting colour. But in fact, there are reports. Harley has found that there were several reports of Hilliard using green verditer, perhaps in large rather than in miniature paintings. But it's so that was an interesting confirmation of workshop. It's not just the pigments, of course, but techniques, although this could be called another pigment that we have here. This is a highlight on one of the jewels on the pelican portrait, and it's done with a tiny spot of silver leaf here, and rather than a highlight of white, as we might expect. And again, going to Hilliard, he says, he recommends for miniature painting a base of cream-coloured paint being dry. Give the light of your pearl. This is on a pearl rather than a ruby. Give the light of your pearl with silver, as round, as full as you can. And of course, cutting a piece of silver leaf into a round would be quite a difficult thing, which is why he says as full as you can. And what we don't know is whether this was actually fuller. It's quite difficult to tell. We can see on other rubies elsewhere on the costume around here that some has been bossed, but we can't be sure about that. Techniques very, very different on the Darnley portrait of painting jewellery. Here, a slightly later way of depicting pearls can be seen in this raking light photograph of building up an impasto to a highlight. Both those systems would work in an unsteady light of candles or from a changing sunlight, so that the light of the impasto would catch the eye and make the jewellery more vibrant, and as the light of the silver in different lights would catch the eye. So, but it's interesting to see a miniaturist technique being used by Hilliard on these larger paintings, if indeed they are by Hilliard. Now, there are more hidden techniques, and we're sometimes not aware now of the sorts of underlying materials that make up the painting and that give an illusion of either wealth to painting or a beautiful material. And this, in fact, is silver leaf underneath the red glaze here. And I haven't got a detail of that because I believe it's going to be talked about by somebody else later in the conference. This was an extraordinary find. This is a micro photograph of this corner here, the carpet, and underneath the red is a layer of azurite. Now, this wouldn't normally be any surprise, because we might think that the whole carpet was done with azurite, or that it was just a slip over where azurite was being to colour the carpet. But in fact, and the cross-section shows it as well, firmly underneath. If we then had cross-sections from other parts of the painting, up where the an original window has been covered over, so we've got that layer. Sorry, can't seem to get the light to stay on. The second layer up from the bottom is the old window, but underneath it is this extraordinarily good quality azurite used as an underlayer. I'm very interested to hear if anybody else has come across such an underlayer on a painting. I haven't done. And this is another painting. We're thinking about master. Well, I'm not thinking about it, but scholars, Tudor scholars, are thinking that these are from the same workshop, Master John, and that. But it's certain that these, both the Edward VI and the Catherine Parr, have this extraordinary underlayer of azurite. Sorry, I think I don't want to show that yet. I hadn't. Other hidden effects and other techniques that we found underneath the painting by looking at very, very closely and by looking cross section show how extraordinarily detailed some of these techniques are. We don't know whether they had whether artists painted with using glasses, as this painter is doing. But in I think it's about 1548. But it certainly had access to magnification. Oh, sorry. How do I get that back? But painters seem to have painted in techniques that are invisible to the naked eye, but have an effect on the surface. And here you see a painter using a marl stick with very fine brushes to paint this sort of effect, which is from the sleeve of John Donne, and you can see that the tiny soft-haired brush has been used to twisted round just like thread to give this gold thread, the illusion of this gold thread. Other techniques, rather extraordinary techniques of combing in the portrait of Throckmorton, you can see on the pillar that is imitating stone. There are many other rather extraordinary techniques in the sword, pulling out all the stops really in technical illusion. This was shown earlier. Morris showed the vigorous brushwork on this painting. What you can see in here are these little bits of hair. Now, we frequently, I'm sure lots of you will have come across hair, brush hairs in painting, or human hairs in a painting, but they usually have a thin end to them, the end of the hair. But these were all chopped hairs or fibres, and I don't know what they are. And I wondered whether actually it says under the illustration "beard hair?" ? Because I wondered whether either that they'd been brushed with such a vigorous brush that they'd come off, and the brush itself was made with beard hair, as is sometimes the case, or hair that's been chopped off. to give a certain effect, or that there'd been an early morning shaving session in the studio, and these had been left. I've got one tiny 1 millimetre fragment, so I'm hoping that an archaeologist will be able to identify it. Other effects that are for practical purposes are this fingerprint process that, to lay a glaze, to make a glaze more even. But of course it also has, and it's from this edging here, it also has an effect on, I think, bringing out, allowing the smoothness of the portrait in the centre to stand out by making this with fingerprints here, making it to have a more matte effect. We see it much later, don't we, in Claude's paintings, palm prints and in the background to lessen the smoothness. And there are many instances of trying to handle smalt. Smalt is a very difficult pigment to handle. It's cobalt glass. It's very coarse. It can't be ground too finely, otherwise it loses its colour. And it's of course called strewing blue in some cases, where painters threw the blue onto a wet surface to get it to spread evenly. And this is a detail of the background here, and it's also used in this Edward VI, but it's also deteriorated here. But you can see the vertical stripes of a comb that's been used. I did try this, and it does work in spreading the pigment much more evenly. But I wonder whether it also has an aesthetic effect on that paint, with the verticality of this, emphasising the verticality of that. This painting leads on to looking at painting, the way painting is deteriorated, and how we have to be so careful now about what we're seeing. And of course everybody, I think, is becoming familiar with backgrounds that were once a beautiful blue, as you can see from this photograph under the microscope, and at the edge where it hasn't been exposed too much, there's still the smalt can be seen. But there are many other bits of this painting, I'm afraid, that have deteriorated. The artist could have used something like this, which is indigo, used on Thomas Cromwell, much later, of course. Now we know through dendrochronology that this is a much later painting than the period that we were looking at with Edward. So perhaps they saw that smalt was deteriorating at that stage and started to use indigo. You can see how indigo, though, itself fades by this portrait of, this is William Butts, and where it's been covered by the frame, what a beautiful blue it must have been originally. This is just showing yellow lake that's faded from the top of the green, mixed green, indigo and yellow lake, but at the top where it's been exposed to the light, it's faded. Yes, this is where I wanted this picture, just to show you how good smalt can be, what a fantastic colour it is when it's been put on, and that would be a reason for using it. Here's the silver underneath the red glaze. So all sorts of other things have happened to this. The tunic has lost its red glaze because it's an organic pigment. And we can see little bits of it where, in its original condition, where the gold leaf on top of it, this is from the cuff, has actually preserved the colour by keeping it from light. The rose, unfortunately, has used a copper green glaze at one stage, which has gone brown. And you can see it on the stalk, and the rose itself has faded, the crimson lake in that has faded. So instead of looking rather more like this rose and the reds and greens of this, it's it looks very unobtrusive rather than being a massive symbol and wonderfully profiled. Red Lake fading, sorry, this is again from Pelican Portrait. You can see the dramatic difference between that. And this is azurite discolouring the medium round it. So it would have been a beautiful blue. So one has to try and rethink the image of pink and blue, and then this was purple, the outer one. So a rainbow effect. Lastly, this was a very interesting case of which really hasn't been, the conclusion of which hasn't been agreed on, but we've looked at these. When I was looking at these decorations, which are in fact raised, you can see that by the raking light that they're raised. These decorations were consisted of smalt mixed with Crimson Lake. And here you can see the smalt, one particle of it survived, and then a bit of Crimson Lake. But both those elements, as in the Cranmer, have deteriorated and been lost. What we don't know, what we didn't know, is whether the smalt was simply put in as a bulking agent to get this lovely raised effect of the embroidery, or whether it was for coloristic purposes, and whether, in fact, these embroidered edges were purple. If we look at this image, we can see that along the bottom edge here, this was taken along the bottom edge where it's covered with the frame, the red lake has disappeared from the yellow. So the insides of these embroideries would have been quite a definite orangey or warm yellow rather than the cool yellow. But would these outer embroideries have been purple? That's the question. Now, Marika Spring looked at the sample that I took very kindly, and she has found that the potassium in the smalt indicates, the proportion of it indicates that it was coloured. Most of it was coloured quite a strong blue, and I'm sure she can tell you better than I how she did that. But this is means that there would have been at least an element of blue in it. So was it maroon? Was it a strong purplish red, or was it purple? Of course, there are finally there are things that the artist changed about paintings. And this is a cross section just to show that from underneath here, where the snake or the serpent runs underneath, and the same paint was used underneath for the dress and then on top to cover it over. So that was conclusive evidence that it wasn't a later alteration. And I'd like to thank these people. And you'll be seeing Ian Towers after my revenge for after lunch. Thank you.